This video is brought to you by Women in Parenthesis, a project exploring the work of Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe and Mary Midgley. To find out more about us and access worksheets and podcasts about these four amazing philosophers, visit us at womeninparenthesis.co.uk. Elizabeth Anscombe on Consequentialism. Gertrude Elizabeth Anscombe, known as G.E.M. Anscombe or Elizabeth Anscombe, was a philosopher who lived from 1919 until 2001. She wrote one of the most famous and influential moral philosophy articles of the 20th century, called Modern Moral Philosophy, in 1958. This article is credited with really kicking off a whole new movement in ethics. Now, Anscombe was the first philosopher to use the word consequentialism. And you might be familiar with this term already when you've been looking at utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, the basic meaning of the word is pretty straightforward. It's all about moral theories that concern themselves with the consequences or results of our actions. So other theories are concerned with rules or duties, such as don't lie, or with character, motivations and virtues. So think, for example, about why we might think that it is, at least most of the time, wrong to steal. Well, you might think it's wrong because it's simply a duty that we all have, or you might think it's wrong because it's something that bad people do, that someone who steals is lacking some of the important traits that good people have. But alternatively, you might think that stealing is wrong because it has bad effects. So perhaps because it makes people upset or it makes it harder for people to get by in their lives. Now, if you're concerned with these bad effects, you are concerned with consequences. Now, pretty much all moral theories would say that consequences matter to some extent, but the question is how central they are for the theory. And for consequentialists, it's these consequences that are the really big deal. Now, today we normally take the term consequentialism to include all utilitarians, but Anscombe used it a bit differently from that. So she thought that the early utilitarians, like Bentham and Mill, had been replaced in the 20th century by a different sort of thinker. And she was very concerned about these thinkers. She thought that they took the idea of consequences to ridiculous extremes, and they wouldn't rule out any act, no matter how awful or monstrous it was, if it led to the right consequences. So for a consequentialist, as she understands it, only consequences matter, and nothing else matters at all. She thought that this new consequentialism had started with the philosopher Henry Sidgwick and had become widespread ever since. Now, we'll come back in a bit to whether we think that Anscombe was right about this. But first, let's think a bit more about why Anscombe objected to consequentialism so much. Anscombe thought that this new consequentialism was a dangerous step for moral philosophy to have taken. And this was because it allowed people to commit terrible acts in the name of good consequences. So nothing was so bad that we could say we must never do that without first examining the consequences that would result from that action. So no act at all, even something like a brutal murder, could be ruled out on principle, provided that committing it would bring about the best expected consequences. One example that Anscombe was very passionate about was the dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this was done in order to bring the Second World War to a more rapid close, and the argument was that this saved more lives. But Anscombe thought that this action could not be justified by the aim of ending the war, even if more lives ended up being saved. Some actions, she argued, are so fundamentally wrong that no expected consequences can justify them. Other examples that you might think about could include things like torturing innocent people in order to save lives, or convicting an innocent person of a crime in order to avoid greater harms caused by rioting. So Anscombe was concerned with all these cases when a terrible act might be performed in order to achieve good consequences. We shouldn't, she said, take it as a given that we can do whatever we like provided we end up getting the right results. Now, one of the reasons that this was a deep concern for her was that consequentialism completely ignores the significance of notions such as intention, motive, or character. These were very big concepts for Anscombe, and it's part of why she can be credited with pioneering a revival of virtue ethics, a kind of moral theory concerned with how we should live and what kinds of people we should be. She thought that things like this, such as character or intention, are absolutely essential to understanding morality. And for this reason, ethics can't be boiled down to consequences. In fact, ethics can't be done at all without conducting a proper study of human nature and psychology. It's not enough just to look at an act and weigh up what happens as a result. We need to think about what sort of person is performing the act and why they're performing it. Now, one thing we might ask ourselves about here is why Anscombe thought that these new consequentialists of the 20th century were such a different breed from earlier utilitarian thinkers like Bentham and Mill. Now, this isn't an easy question to answer because Anscombe doesn't attempt to do this, but she does seem to presume that it would have been unthinkable for people like Bentham and Mill to support, for example, the bombing of innocent populations to bring an end to a war. So maybe she thought that Bentham would see examples like this as problems that he would have to solve to show that such acts would be unacceptable within his theory. So let's imagine that Bentham is faced with a situation where achieving the greatest happiness of the greatest number involves doing something absolutely awful like torturing children. Do we think he would shrug and accept that it was a difficult thing to do but still the right thing? I don't know. Bentham has been dead for quite a long time. But perhaps Anscombe's thought was that Bentham would see this as a problem that needed to be solved. John Stuart Mill was a bit different from Bentham. So in his case, we might say that he differs from this later breed of consequentialists because of his indirect utilitarianism. So Mill thought that in certain cases, we should do things that didn't lead to the best consequences. So take the example of torture. So imagine an individual instance of torture that might reveal important information. Actually, we can say as an aside, the evidence suggests that it's pretty unreliable for this, but let's just go with it for now. So Mill might claim that the general consequences of allowing torture overall are so bad that it should never be committed, even in particular cases that might, in rare circumstances, lead to the best results. Now, although Anscombe didn't regard Bentham and Mill as consequentialists, she did still disagree with their approach to ethics, but this was for different reasons. So she thought that their idea of pleasure was too shallow and simplistic to do the work that it was meant to do in their theories. So here are some questions to think about. What did Anscombe mean by consequentialism? Is she right to argue that consequentialism allows people to do terrible things to achieve good consequences? And do you think this is a problem for the theory? Can you think of your own examples of a bad act that's performed for good consequences? This doesn't need to be anything dramatic like war or torture. It could be quite a trivial example from your own life. Is it still morally acceptable to perform that action? Are there any limits to what we can do, provided that the consequences turn out for the best? Do you think there are important aspects of our moral lives that consequentialism leaves out or ignores? And do you think Anscombe was right in saying that the utilitarianism of Mill and Bentham doesn't face the same kind of problem? That's all for now. You can learn more about Elizabeth Anscombe at womeninparenthesis.co.uk. Goodbye.